SpongeBob SquarePants is a Nickelodeon cartoon that debuted in 1999. Even though some unfortunate souls weren't allowed to watch it growing up, due to its popularity, most of us now know the gist of what SpongeBob is all about. The show revolves around a group of talking underwater sea creatures, and as the title suggests, the main character is a sponge that wears square pants. The show follows the daily life of this optimistic sponge. In the fourth episode, we learn that SpongeBob is enrolled in Mrs. Puff's boating school, where he's trying to earn his boating license. In this episode, we learn that he's already taken and failed the exam 37 times, and throughout the series of the show, we watch him take and fail the same exam several more times. My question is there anything going on in the classroom specifically that could be preventing SpongeBob from succeeding? Motivation is a huge factor in how successful an individual is in the classroom. In SpongeBob's case, he arrives to class hours early, he arrives to his exam with the mindset that he's going to pass it this time, he's very persistent even though he keeps failing. And from these observations, we can assume that SpongeBob has a lot of intrinsic motivation. And on top of that, Mrs. Puff builds an extrinsic motivation in her students with her Good Noodle Star system. In this episode, we see that this system works for SpongeBob because when Mrs. Puff removes one of SpongeBob's stars for his misbehavior, SpongeBob begins crying dramatically and immediately changes his behavior to try and earn it back. So it's clear that a lack of motivation is not what's preventing SpongeBob's success. In the episode Procrastination, we get to see what it's like for SpongeBob to complete his homework at home. Mrs. Puff assigns her students the task of writing an 800-word essay about what not to do at a stoplight. SpongeBob is eager to complete the assignment when he gets home, but when he gets there, he's met with all kinds of distractions and cannot focus. He takes several breaks to feed his pet snail, make a sandwich, tries to make small talk with the mailman, his friends want him to come outside and play, and then he eventually just falls asleep, and when he wakes up, it's 5 minutes before it's time for class. SpongeBob ends up completing the essay in those 5 minutes, but the point I want to make from this episode is that Mrs. Puff simply assigned this assignment and left her students to figure out everything on their own with no form of direction or guidance. However, in this episode, we see Mrs. Puff demonstrate a form of scaffolding when she guides SpongeBob through an alternative extra credit assignment after he has failed his final exam once again. All he has to do is write 10 words about what he learned in boating school. When she sees that SpongeBob is struggling to complete this assignment, she then guides him through it by saying all he needs to write is, "What I learned in boating school is blankety blankety blank." When SpongeBob is finished, the assignment is obviously not complete, but Mrs. Puff is so tired of having SpongeBob in her class that she decides to overlook it and pass him anyway. As SpongeBob is walking away with his license, Mrs. Puff begins to question whether or not she made a good decision as she imagines SpongeBob driving around destroying everyone and everything. When SpongeBob's parents throw him a party to celebrate his accomplishment and surprise him with a new boatmobile, Mrs. Puff cannot handle the potential threat she has caused to society, so she attempts to resolve this issue by stealing his boatmobile. What she doesn't realize is that SpongeBob had fallen asleep in the back seat. The two of them get into a fight, SpongeBob rips off her mask, and he's shocked to find Mrs. Puff underneath. Mrs. Puff is still behind the wheel of this moving boat as all of this is happening, and she ends up losing control and crashing into a police car. They send her to jail, and it's here that Mrs. Puff apologizes to SpongeBob for passing him when she knew he wasn't ready. From this episode, we can see the potential negative consequences of falsely passing a student. You cannot simply pass someone because they may end up facing even more challenges wherever they end up next. It's important that teachers create an environment in their classroom where students feel safe emotionally as well as physically. In the episode Flats the Flounder, Flats is a new student that tells SpongeBob repeatedly that he's going to kick his butt. SpongeBob reports these threats to Mrs. Puff, but she does not consider these accusations to be true because Flats has made himself out to be a good, innocent student. There is no doubt that SpongeBob's fear of his life had a major impact on his education during the time that Flats was there, and we see this when he asks Mrs. Puff if he can be excused for the rest of his life, and even goes as far as to hide in the toilet. Mrs. Puff's failure to address this issue created an environment where bullying is tolerated, and SpongeBob is spending more time worrying about his safety rather than the content being taught. So we can see that Mrs. Puff has done some good along with some bad in regards to her teaching, but one way to ultimately determine if she really is the problem would be to simply replace her, which is exactly what happened in the episode Mrs. Puff, You're Fired. Mrs. Puff is told that if SpongeBob fails one more time, she's going to lose her job, and of course SpongeBob fails and a new strict instructor named Sergeant Roderick takes over. He is super cruel and makes SpongeBob crawl, walk, run, and then drive the driving course blindfolded. Although SpongeBob manages to successfully complete these tasks, including driving the course blindfolded, when it's time for him to take the final exam and has to take the blindfold off, he fails once again. As we can see, Mrs. Puff is not the determining factor to SpongeBob's failure. Even a change in instructors did not aid SpongeBob in his learning. Although Mrs. Puff wasn't the difference in whether or not SpongeBob failed, she still failed SpongeBob in that she made no attempt to see that he received more individualized assistance. SpongeBob's experience at Mrs. Puff's boating school shows the difficulty of teaching students at different developmental stages and the need for more individualized instruction.